I just need somebody to listen to me. Even if you think I'm mad. I'm literally at the point that I don't care anymore. Everything changed ever since that thing showed up, and now it won't leave me alone. It all started a couple of months ago. God, it feels like longer than that now. I was going about my morning routine as normal. I'd woken up a little later than normal, so rather than having breakfast at home before going to work, I decided to pick something up at my local cafe. It was on the way to work, and normally not too busy at this time in the morning, so I'd have plenty of time for a bacon sandwich and an espresso to wake me up. Walking into town, I cut through the bustling crowds of people heading to their 9-to-5s. I was making good time, and I could see my destination just ahead of me. The sign in the window of the cafe promising warmth and sustenance. Thoughts of that bacon sandwich caused me to salivate. Just as I was about to approach the door, my attention was suddenly captivated by an odd whimpering sound coming from my right. It seemed faint and quiet, like a pained animal. It was definitely odd, to say the least. Curious, I followed it, leading me to the alley just beside the cafe. It was a high-pitched, pained noise that seemed to be reverberating from the walls further within. Whatever was making it obviously needed help, but deep down, there was something about it I couldn't quite put my finger on. Tentatively, I slowly poked my head around the wall, bringing the narrow alleyway into view. The buildings pressing in on both sides seemed to loom over the thin concrete floor, speckled with bins and other rubbish. It seemed still and quiet, except for the noise. As I looked further along into the alley, the hairs on the back of my neck seemed to stand to attention as a strange feeling washed over me. It was almost eerie. Movement to the left caught my eye. A quick rustling of a bin bag. Focusing on it, my mind raced with possibilities as to what could be responsible, and that feeling of unease began to snake its way up my spine. Then, something emerged from behind one of the bins. I jumped with a start, my heart pounding in my chest until, with relief, I realized what it was. A stray dog. Mangy and malnourished, the poor thing looked as though it was starving. Its flea-ridden fur was matted, and its skeleton was clearly visible under the taut skin, attempting to force its way out. A mixture of both pity and disgust bubbled in my stomach as I watched it struggling to stand. I felt sorry for the poor thing. It obviously needed help, and it didn't look like it had long left. Hell, it looked half dead already. Who knows how long it had been out here for, or when it last had a decent meal. Maybe if I could get it to come to me, I could take it to a shelter or something. At least get it something to eat, I thought. Squatting down on my heels, I held out my hand, gesturing to the dog, trying to be as non-threatening as possible. I made all sorts of soft cooing sounds in an attempt to coax the poor creature from its hiding place. As it raised its head to me, an eerie feeling washed over me. It fixed me with its cloudy, dead gaze. I can't explain what it was. It was almost like it was looking into me, like there was something just beneath the surface of those glassy orbs. Like they weren't its eyes. Shuddering, I tried to shake the feeling off. It was just a stray dog, I kept telling myself. It was obviously going blind. It needed help. I needed to help it. Continuing with the cooing sounds and clicking my tongue, I watched as the dog slowly lowered its head and began taking a cautious step towards me. It seemed to shiver with each step, as though fighting with all of its might not to collapse underneath its own weight. The poor thing was obviously terrified. As it got closer, it was almost within touching distance of me, when a loud crash from the right caused it to yelp and flee with a start. It ran deeper into the alleyway, yelping as it went, moving with an unnatural speed considering its decrepit appearance. My heart sank a little as it vanished down the alley. There was no way I'd be able to catch it now. It was far too quick. That noise had probably just sealed the dog's fate. Trying my best to forget about it, I made my way back to the front of the cafe to get myself something to eat before another grinding day of sitting at a desk. Rounding the corner of the alley and making my way to the cafe door, it looked busier than normal. Looking through the window, I could see the shop was filled with several people, far more than the usual 5 or 6 that seemed to frequent it. It took me a few seconds to realise that something was wrong. Rather than standing in an orderly queue, the patrons all seemed to be crowded around something on the floor. Confused, I made my way inside. There was a tangible feeling of panic in the air, and although I had only just entered, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of dread welling up in me. Several people seemed to be crowded around what looked like a person lying on the floor. Some were crying, some were attempting to give CPR, while others were making frantic phone calls. The frantic energy in the air was overwhelming. My mind flashed back to the crashing noise in the alley, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was somehow related. Shocked by the scene in front of me, I backed away into the corner of the shop as another customer frantically brushed past me, knocking me into another bystander. They seemed to stand there, still as the dead, not registering my impact. Their eyes were fixed, watching the scene unfold before them. "What's going on? What happened?" I asked, a note of panic in my voice betraying my composure. "The server," they said in a far-off voice, as though deep in some kind of trance. She was fine 1 second, and the next she was on the floor, convulsing. Pausing, he slowly turned to face me, his eyes rimmed with tears and fear. We couldn't get a pulse. Mortified, all I could do was stand there, staring at the poor unmoving woman on the floor. After what felt like hours, an ambulance pulled up outside the cafe, and 2 tired-looking paramedics burst through the door. Forcing their way through the panicked crowd, they dropped to a crouch by the woman on the floor. As the crowd parted, I managed to catch a glimpse of her face. It was only for a second, but that was long enough for the terrible image to be seared into my mind. Her skin was a mottled blue. A thick froth of saliva lined the edges of her pale lips, and her bulging eyes were bloodshot and unmoving. It was awful. If I close my eyes, I can still clearly remember the pained look on her face, as though I was there right now. In what felt like slow motion, I watched as one of the paramedics crouched next to her, began to check her over, testing responsiveness and relaying answers to his partner, who made notes on his pad. After a few minutes, he climbed to his feet, a solemn look on his face, before turning to his partner and declaring the time of death. A cold feeling washed over me, as though all of the air had been drained from the room, and I could feel a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Nausea soon followed. I stumbled out of the cafe, the warm air outside doing nothing to clear the chill that had crept up within me, nor quell the sickness steadily rising in my throat. I'd never seen anything like that, never seen someone die. Obviously, you see it all the time on TV and in video games, but it was nothing like that. I couldn't get the image of her face out of my mind. Those staring, bloodshot eyes. I tried to compose myself, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. Work. I needed to get to work. I was already running late as it was. I began making my way to the office, legs shaking, still unable to clear the thoughts of that woman from my mind. I don't think I even remembered getting breakfast in the end. My life carried on pretty much as normal after that, although I did still get flashes of what I'd seen in that cafe. They died off after a few days, and I happily carried on as though the incident had never happened. I'd say it was fine, until around a week afterwards. I was walking through town. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was running a few errands, getting my groceries, life admin. Anyway, as I was making my way down one of the side streets on my way to the hardware store, I needed a light bulb, as the one in my bathroom had popped on me that morning. A slight movement from the alleyway to my right caught my eye. Turning to face it, I was met with the sight of two milky eyes staring back at me from further within, surrounded by matted dark fur. It was the dog. The same one that I'd seen that day at the cafe. As soon as I saw it, the memories of that previous encounter jumped to the forefront of my mind. That woman's cold blue face. The dog was staring at me, unblinking, almost unmoving but for the wagging of its tail. The way its eyes seemed to bore into me, almost searching me for something, brought back that same eerie feeling I'd felt last time. Only something about the animal seemed different this time. I know it was stupid, but I could have sworn it looked less dishevelled. Although its fur was still matted and unkempt, it somehow seemed fuller. Its bones were less visible, still present, but less defined, as though it had managed to eat a couple of times since the last time I saw it. As though remembering the last time, it lowered its head and began to tentatively approach me, all the while keeping me locked in its cloudy gaze. As repulsed as I was by the creature, I knew it still needed help. Now I had another chance to get it somewhere that would give it the care that it needed, to save it. Fighting off the unease that its gaze had instilled in me, I slowly reached out my hand and called to it, careful not to be too loud or quick in case I startled it. If I could just get it, I could take it to a shelter or somewhere, get it off the streets and give it a fighting chance at surviving. It inched towards me, its steps stronger and more confident. It was so close, barely an arm's length away. I held my breath, wary of any sound that might startle the poor thing and undo all of my progress. I was just about to touch my fingers to the mangy fur on the poor creature's head, when a loud screeching of tires, followed by a heavy thump of metal on metal and smashing of glass, exploded from behind me, echoing between the walls of the alley. I reeled around, heart thumping, frantically scanning for the source of the noise. The dog, obviously startled by the cacophony, bolted past me and out into the street, running with that same unnatural speed before disappearing around the corner of the alleyway. I barely noticed as it brushed past my legs. I was transfixed by the sight before me. As I slowly made my way out of the alley and onto the street, the full impact of the horrific scene before me took hold as fear and confusion welled up in me. Black rubber skid marks lined the road, and sparkling shards of glass lined the floor like a thin layer of transparent snow. The marks, swerving back and forth, led to what remained of a small white car. Puddles of oil and other fluids were pooling at the base of the now crumpled car, its front bumper practically invisible, fused with the parked van in front of it. The smell of burning rubber and leaking fuel was thick in the air, filling my lungs. As I tried to start processing what I'd seen, to try and even imagine how this could have happened, I became aware of the screams of other pedestrians on the street. They were staring, wide-eyed as they took in that same terrible sight. As I traced their gazes, my eyes met with the source of their terrified expressions. Leaking out from under the driver's side door was a thick, deep, crimson liquid. It was pooling on the floor beneath the vehicle, mixing with the oil and fuel in a grotesque puddle. As I raised my eyes, following it, I saw something that made the blood drain from my face. Something pink, spattered with red, jutting out of the window of the car. An arm. Bent at an unnatural angle, it was sticking out of the driver's side window. shards of glass embedded deep within it. I could barely recognize anything in the fleshy pulp that it was attached to. Holding back a swell of vomit, I realized that what remained of the driver had been twisted and pulverized into an unnatural shape, its limbs jutting at angles that the human body should never have been able to achieve. I had to turn away as the swell of vomit threatened to overtake me. The scene was chaotic. People were crying, frantically making phone calls and panicking. Some were running to the car to try and help, although I had no idea what they could do for the driver now. All I could do was stand there, watching, dumbfounded. I'd never seen anyone die before, and now within the space of a week, I'd seen 2 people meet their untimely ends in awful ways. My mind reeled with questions. What had happened? Why had both of these happened when I was there? How could I have gone through all of my life only to see 2 gruesome deaths in the space of a week? Then another thought rose to my mind. That dog. That dog had been there both times too, always disappearing just as the poor souls were cut from this mortal coil. No, it was just a coincidence. That was all. The dog was just a stray. Blind chance was the reason I'd seen it at both of these awful accidents. There was no way it could have been involved. I was just being stupid. As if suddenly remembering it existed, I glanced around, looking for any sign of the flea-ridden creature. I couldn't help the driver of the car, but I could still help that dog. Scanning the street in the direction I'd seen it running, there was nothing, aside from the debris from the crash and the growing crowd of pedestrians. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Knowing how absurd this was going to seem, what with the terrible scene behind me, I made my way over to one of the other pedestrians standing close by. She'd been standing next to me when I first came out of the alleyway. The dog would have had to run past her as it fled. "Excuse me, sorry, I know this is going to sound really weird, but you didn't see a stray dog run past just before this happened, did you?" I said, embarrassedly, gesturing to the scene behind me. What?" she replied, as though I'd snapped her out of a trance. "Dog? Distracted, she tilted her head in thought, not taking her eyes from the crash. "Nope, sorry, I didn't see any dog." She must have missed it, being distracted by the crash. I couldn't say I wouldn't have been the same. It probably ran past her as she was watching the carnage, and she didn't even realize. I mean, it was just a dog after all. Still, I couldn't help but dwell on the fact that it had still been there both times. A shudder ran down my spine as I remembered the eerie feeling it had instilled in me with those cloudy globes of its eyes. The police arrived shortly afterwards and ushered the crowd away, cordoning off the entire area with "Do Not Cross" tape. My mind was filled with images of the crash and the blue face of the cafe worker as I tried my best to carry on with my day. I made it 3 more days after that. 3 more normal, uninterrupted days before things got worse. I'd arranged to drop my car, a small Ford Fiesta, in at my local garage for its yearly servicing. It was a bit out of the way, being on the other side of town, but Carl had done it for me every year previously. He was a bit unkempt and untidy, but he was thorough, and I trusted him implicitly. Setting off earlier than usual, I made my way across town before pulling into the long country road leading down to Carl's cars. Turning the corner into the courtyard of the garage, I was met by the familiar sight of several cars, all left scattered about the lot with no rhyme or reason as to their positioning. As I pulled in, I saw Carl tinkering away under the hood of an older-looking Mercedes, his greasy hands tightly forcing a socket wrench against something that didn't want to budge. He lifted his head, hearing the sounds of my engine, and waved as he saw me, a large smile lighting up his aged features. He always seemed genuinely happy whenever a customer came to his business. It was another reason I came to him year after year. Pulling into an empty space and setting the car in park, I did one final check to make sure I'd taken out everything I needed. I intended to leave the car with Carl, take the nearby bus back to town, wait until Carl called me to say it was done, and pick it up later. When I was sure there was nothing else in the car that I would miss, I got out and started making my way over to him. He greeted me warmly, wiping the sweat from his brow as he did so, leaving a greasy trail behind. He didn't seem to notice. His skin was leathery and tanned, years of damage from the sun clearly taking its toll. He asked me how things had been since last year, and I could tell from his tone he was genuinely interested. Despite his rugged appearance, he had a way with people. I explained about the events of the past few weeks and how they'd been constantly playing on my mind. Awful shame that. There's no rhyme or reason to how the universe works sometimes, he said, shaking his head, a pensive look spreading across his heavy features. We talked for a while longer, making the usual small talk, before ultimately I handed him the keys. I could have stopped and talked with him all morning, but I was acutely aware of the nagging sensation in my brain, the one telling me that if I didn't leave soon, I would miss my bus. Waving farewell to Carl, I started to make my way down the country lane that led from Carl's to the nearest bus stop, taking time to appreciate the quietness of the area. The rolling fields surrounding it, and the hint of a dense forest in the distance, were beautiful and made a pleasant difference from the large concrete structures of town. After a few minutes of walking, the bus stop loomed into view. It was a small, run-down hut that looked as though it had been there for decades, and was in desperate need of modernisation. Its aging structure contained only a single bench and a timetable plastered to the one wall. Checking my watch to make sure I was still ahead of the bus, I sighed with relief as I realised I'd made it with a few minutes to spare. Taking a seat at the bench, deciding to treat myself to a nice seat while I waited, I opened up my news app on my phone and began to read. I'd only been sitting for a couple of seconds at most, just loading up a new article on my phone, when I felt something warm brush against my leg. It was accompanied by a ragged, laboured panting sound that caused all of the colour to drain from my face. My mind reeled, thinking about whatever creature could have been making that noise. Slowly, and with great effort, I brought my gaze down to where I'd felt the sensation, fearing whatever it was that had been hiding in the hut, watching me, waiting. I was met with the sight of mangy, matted fur and a cold, cloudy stare. My jaw dropped as I recognised the repulsive homeless dog that I'd seen over the past couple of weeks, leaning gently against my leg. Again, it looked different from before. Still coated in mangy fur, and still sporting those cloudy, milky orbs for eyes, its skeleton was no longer visible beneath its skin, as though it had started returning to something akin to a healthy weight. How was it here, on the other side of town? On the outskirts, no less. It would have had to have wandered for miles. And what were the chances of it being there, at this bus stop, with me? It fixed me with one of its cloudy eyes, staring at me as its tail slowly started wagging behind it expectantly. The eerie feeling that I'd felt each time before seemed to raise its ugly head again as the dog slowly bent forwards. I couldn't move, stunned, as it nudged my leg with its snout, looking at me as though waiting for something before raising its head towards my limp hand. Still not quite understanding what was going on, I slowly reached my hand down, feeling the matted, unwashed fur crunching as, with a shiver, my fingers began stroking its head. All the while I was aware of how matted and unkempt its fur was as it tangled around my fingers, sending shivers of revulsion through me. The dog opened its mouth and began to let out that same laboured panting that I'd heard when it brushed against my leg, As the stench of its breath hit my nostrils, it was suffocating. I nearly gagged. I know dog's breath normally stinks, but this was rotten, like something in the late stages of decay. It was almost toxic. There was something about this dog that didn't sit right, something I couldn't explain. I found myself staring into its cloudy eyes, almost transfixed, unable to pry my gaze away. It was as though there was something there in them, something hidden, just beneath the milky white, just out of sight. The loud hiss of hydraulic brakes snapped my attention back to my current surroundings, ripping my gaze from those unnatural eyes. Snapping my head to the right, I saw the bus lowering itself down as its sliding doors spread open for me. Quickly turning back to the dog, I was shocked to find only empty space next to me, my hand floating in the air where that mutt had been just moments ago. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized with confusion that the hut was empty. Other than me standing there was no sign anyone had been there at all. Shaken, I turned away, stepping into the bus's cabin as the doors began to slowly close behind me. As I was getting my change to pay for the journey, I asked the bus driver if he'd seen the dog, seen which way it had run when he pulled up. Even though it had freaked me the hell out, it still needed help. It seemed to be doing better each time I'd seen it, but if it stayed out here, chances are it would definitely die. Not that there was anything I could do for it now anyway. What he said made my strength leave me, and I suddenly became aware of exactly how heavy my body was. Quickly paying for my ticket, I staggered deeper into the bus before collapsing into a seat, unsure of how much longer my legs would have held out. My mind was reeling as that sentence replayed over and over in my head. "I didn't see any dog, mate. Just you waiting in the hut." As I sat there, staring at the passing fields slowly being replaced by the concrete buildings of my town, the vibrations of the bus rising through me, I couldn't help but think about that dog. How had the bus driver not seen it? It had been standing right next to me as he pulled up. I was stroking its head. Perhaps it had bolted as the doors opened, ran in his blind spot maybe? Still, surely he would have seen something. A creeping chill caused the hairs on my neck to stand on end as I remembered its glassy-eyed stare, the way it seemed as though it was looking into me rather than at me. Memories of the previous encounters floated slowly to the forefront of my mind. Every time I'd encountered that dog, its eyes seemed more and more like they belonged to something else. And it looked different. No longer the malnourished waif that I'd seen the first time. If I didn't know better, I would have just thought it was an unkempt pet. There was definitely something unnatural about that dog. With the memories came the images of the accidents that had happened shortly afterwards, after each time that I tried to interact with the dog. Try as I might, I still couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow linked. But then again, I'd seen that dog just now, and nothing bad had happened. Other than it making me jump out of my skin and then vanishing without a trace. Everything seemed perfectly normal, in fact. A nervous chuckle slipped out from under my breath. I was jumping to conclusions. There was no way a dog could have been responsible for the accident. It was just a dog after all. Even if it did creep me out a little, that's no reason to assume it had in some way orchestrated those accidents. I felt stupid for even thinking it. As the bus made its way to the centre of town, I started to relax a little, feeling almost lighter somehow, like a great weight had just dissolved away. Going about the rest of my day, I eagerly awaited news of my car, checking my phone every now and again for a text from Carl. Although I didn't live too far away from town, I felt trapped without it. Although it had only been a few hours, I think I was missing the sense of freedom that it brought. With it, I could go anywhere at any time, but now I was stuck here, in the small local area within my meagre walking distance. Checking my watch again, I noticed that I was getting slightly more anxious with each passing second. I tried my best to keep the car in the best condition that I could, so I wasn't expecting anything to come back from the service other than the usual things like oil changes and new filters. There were a lot of cars in the lot as I pulled in, but still, Carl never normally took this long. He was always pretty prompt with me. He must just be busy, I reassured myself, remembering exactly how many other cars had been crammed into the yard of the garage. He's obviously stuck on another one that's taken him longer than he thought or something. Still, even with that reassurance, I couldn't quell the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my stomach. Hours went by uneventfully, the sky outside now beginning to dim, gradually bleeding into a deep red hue. I'd still not heard anything about my car. There was no call from Carl to let me know it was done. Hell, there wasn't even a call to say that he was running late. Nothing. The uneasy feeling that had taken root in my stomach earlier in the day had now transformed, blooming into a sickening worry that grew more oppressive with each passing minute. My gaze was fixed, staring at my phone. I'd been tossing around the idea of calling Carl, just for any kind of update. Anything, really. This really wasn't like him at all. He'd be closing up shop soon, so that would leave me with hardly any time to get there if he had finished with my car. He was cutting it fine. Unable to hold the anxiety at bay any longer, I began dialing Carl's number. All the while I was half expecting my phone to burst into life with an incoming call, like two ships crossing in the night. I had no such luck. Pressing the call button, I held the phone to my ear, the blaring noise of the ringer reverberating through my head with each second that passed. As it rang, I felt a creeping sensation race across my scalp, intensifying as the seconds dragged on and on. After around a minute or so, the ringing stopped, and the sound of the line connecting met my ears. Relief filled me as I heard noise on the other end of the line. Quickly, I blurted out, "Hey Carl, it's me. I just wondered if..." "Hey there, you've reached Carl's Cars. I'm just a little busy out back right now, but if you leave your name and number, I'll give you a call back just as soon as I can." A shrill beep followed as the answering machine clicked on, ready to record my message. The short-lived relief that had filled me moments ago was drained away, leaving only the intensifying anxiety that I'd been feeling before, now bolstered to unbearable levels. With a shaking hand, I hung up. He must have just been caught up with all the work that he had today, I thought to myself. That had to be it. He's probably finished up for the day and forgotten to call. Yeah, that's definitely it. I'm just being silly, I tried to reassure myself. Still, the worry in my stomach was there, ever present, like a dense weight constantly clawing for my attention. I found myself unable to relax for the rest of the evening. Try as I might to quiet them with movies, video games, or reading, my thoughts were a writhing mass, stealing my attention away from any potential distractions. My wife, who could tell that something was wrong, tried her best to comfort me and provide some kind of escape from the way that I was feeling. But regardless of what she tried, or how long I'd be able to banish the anxious feelings for, they always came back. I couldn't help but feel like something was deeply wrong. I had no grounding for it, other than the fact that Carl was normally quite punctual, but I just couldn't shake the feeling. It had wormed its way into my head and was taking up permanent residence. Then, that dog floated to the forefront of my mind, its cloudy eyes staring. The eerie feeling in the pit of my stomach coming back, and my already anxious brain started making all sorts of insane theories. Could the dog be connected in some way? It did seem like whenever I saw it, something bad seemed to happen. So maybe this was another event in that ever-increasing chain. Maybe it had done something. Maybe that's why Carl hadn't called. Maybe it had caused a crash by his garage or something. I stopped that train of thought dead in its tracks. It was just a bloody dog. What was wrong with me? I was just getting myself worked up. I'm sure that Carl would call me in the morning and explain that he was busy or something. Something reasonable and rational, and not worth me losing sleep over. With that final thought, I noticed that the sky was now pitch black. Checking the time on my phone, I jumped with a start. It was nearly midnight. I'd been sitting here for hours, and my wife has long since gone to bed, leaving me the only one awake in the otherwise silent house. Frantically, I got to my feet and started my nightly routine, making sure all of the curtains and doors were locked before brushing my teeth and getting into bed, being as quiet as I could so as not to disturb my wife's slumber. Although the feeling of unease was still clawing at my mind, it was soon overpowered by the wave of sleep that slowly washed over me. The screaming beeps of my alarm dragged me from a dreamless sleep, snapping me back into the waking world with a start. I felt exhausted, drained, like I'd hardly slept at all. As the last hazy remnants of sleep began to slide away, they were slowly replaced by the creeping anxiety I'd felt the night before. Memories of the previous night came flooding back to the forefront of my mind, and I reached frantically for my phone, desperately awaiting a text from Carl. Something to put my mind at ease. As the screen lit up, there was nothing. Just the same picture of me and my wife, staring back at me. He should have texted or called by now. The garage was open, so he should have had some update for me, even if he had been busy yesterday. Frantically, I dialed his number again, the uneasy tension rising to the top of my throat as I waited through those ear-piercing rings. I waited with bated breath for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath until the speaker suddenly burst into life.
Hey there, you've reached Carl's Cars.
A sickening wave crashed over me. I hung the phone up again, my hand shaking as it pressed the end call option. Just what the hell was happening? This wasn't like Carl at all. The anxiety had now transformed into deep, foreboding terror, mingled with dread and concern. After a brief second, I decided that I would physically call him myself after work. Maybe his phone lines were down or something. He might have tried to call me, and he wouldn't have been getting my calls either. I was sure I'd get there and he'd be fine, putting to rest all of the insidious thoughts that were whirling around in my mind as he fixed me with that same warm smile that he always wore. I went about my morning, trying as hard as I could to push the unease about Carl to the fringes of my mind. Getting dressed and eating my breakfast, it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't have a car. I'd have to make my way to the office another way. The idea of walking filled my exhausted mind with dread, so instead I opted to take the bus. Staring unfocused out of its window as the subtle vibrations of the engine coursed through me, I couldn't focus. I tried to watch the town passing me by, but my thoughts were like a thick mud, bogging me down and drawing me back in, no matter how hard I tried to pull myself free. Needing a distraction, I opened the local news app on my phone, hoping that I'd be able to focus on the headlines long enough for a moment of reprieve. It only normally reported on small local stories, not the oppressive doom and gloom of the larger papers, but I'd hoped that it might provide some happy distraction. I could have done with some good news. All strength left me again as a sense of weakness slithered through me. I began visibly shaking as the app opened, and I was greeted with its main headline. With frantic, darting eyes I read the article, its title echoing in my mind. Local mechanic found crushed. Police investigating. The colour drained from my face, and a wave of sickly cold washed over me as my brain processed the finer details of the text. Late last night, the police were called to a mechanic shop just on the edge of town. A customer who'd returned to pick up their car had made a call, sounding distressed and upset. Arriving on the scene shortly afterwards, they'd entered the courtyard to find the place deserted and silent. Carefully making their way around the back, they found what remained of the mechanic sticking out from under the bulk of a small Ford Fiesta. Police and ambulance services were called to the garage, where the mechanic was pronounced dead at the scene. The picture attached to the article clearly showed the garage itself, the words "Carl's Cars" in large letters attached to the front of the building, the lot filled with cars in a scattered pattern. It took everything I had not to drop my phone and curl up into myself. Carl was the only person that worked there. There were no other mechanics. He'd been the only one there for years. He did everything himself. A cold chill ran through my numb form as I realised that the phone was ringing out when I tried to call him last night. Carl was likely trapped beneath the huge hulking mass of what I could only assume to be my car. It would slowly crush him as he reached out, trying with all his remaining might to get to the phone, to let someone know he needed help, but unable to free himself from the mass of metal set on ending his existence. As my eyes focused on the picture again, a small detail caught my eye. Sitting there, in the gaping doorway to the garage, was a shabby-looking dog with matted fur. Whatever remaining composure I'd managed to retain slowly trickled away as I moved my gaze to its eyes. The milky white spheres were staring out at me. It felt like they were reaching through the picture, observing me as I was, right here on this bus. The eerie feeling I'd felt every time I'd seen the creature was back, and now seemed to intensify with each second I spent looking into those eyes. What was it doing there? How did it get into the picture? Surely the police would have assumed it was Carl's and tried to take it to a shelter or something, not just leave it there wandering around. There was no mention of it in the article, but then again, would anyone but me have thought it was relevant? Then yet more thoughts forced themselves to the forefront of my mind. That dog. It had been there, and now Carl was dead. The sickening feeling tightened in my stomach. That's 3 times I'd seen it now, and each time a terrible accident seemed to follow. It was getting to be too much of a coincidence now. I didn't know how, but that dog definitely had something to do with them. I sat there, numb, staring blankly out of the window for the rest of the journey. I just couldn't believe what was happening. I could feel the world passing me by, but I hardly registered anything. Eventually, the bus pulled up onto the street just outside of my office. Autonomously raising myself to my feet, I barely even noticed the hissing of the air brakes and the dropping of the step by the door. I absent-mindedly thanked the driver as I stepped out of the vehicle and into the busy street in front of my office. Everyone around me was going about their day as normal. The throngs of people moving through the streets, blissfully unaware of the dangers that seemed to be lurking in the form of a mangy canine. Desperate for a distraction, anything to quiet the screaming thoughts in my head, and the terrifying conclusions that they were presenting, I made my way as quickly as I could into my office building. Setting up in my cubicle, I began to log into my computer, hearing all of the beeps and whirs dragging me back to my current surroundings as my manager poked his head around the corner, a large grin across his face. It seemed to dim a little as he laid his eyes on me. The panicked expression etched into my face, not hidden at all. Stepping into my cubicle and taking a seat on the edge of my desk, he proceeded to ask me if everything was okay. I didn't know how to respond to him. What was I supposed to say? I didn't know how I could answer that question without anyone thinking I was mad. Sighing defeatedly, I explained about the article I'd read this morning on the bus, about the mechanic, explaining that I'd only seen him the day before, and that the description of the vehicle that had crushed him sounded too much like mine to be anything else. My hand was still trembling as I handed him the article to read. Expressing his sympathies, he looked at me, concerned for a second, before taking it and skimming through it. Unnerved, He handed the phone back to me. You sure you're alright? You can take some time off if you need to get your head straight. Don't worry about this place. We'll still be the same burning dumpster fire as we've always been. I appreciated his concern and kind offer. Although I knew I needed a distraction, I didn't know what use I would be with my brain in this current state. I'd probably end up doing more harm than good. Slowly, I began packing away my things again, thanking him and letting him know I should be back tomorrow. I just need a bit of time, I think. That's all, I said. I'm sure I'll be fine. Although in truth, I had no idea how I would ever feel fine again. I know I couldn't tell him what I really thought. About the dog. About how it was all because of it that this had happened. Still, I felt like I needed to say something, even if it didn't explain exactly how I really felt. Even if it was just to get the slightest bit of this off my chest. That's a weird-looking dog in the picture, huh? I said, feigning a chuckle as I spoke. Feels like it's looking right into your soul or something. Dog? I don't get you, he responded, confusion spreading across his face. In the picture, sat in the garage, staring at the camera. It creeped me out a bit when I first saw it. His confusion evolved into an expression of pity as I showed him that picture again. You should go get some rest. If you've gotten to the point where you're seeing things, then that's a sure sign you need a nap. Now go home and try your best not to think about it too much. He slapped his knees, wishing me all the best before getting up and leaving my cubicle, his words repeated in my head like a skipping record. Seeing things. Had he not seen the dog? It was definitely there, right in the middle of the garage door. Glancing down at the image in the article again, I stared at the picture, hoping that I wasn't going insane. Those dead, milky white eyes stared back up at me, drilling into me through the screen. It was definitely there, wasn't it? It had to be. Gathering up my things, I proceeded home. All the while the thoughts of the morning's events were whirling around like a maelstrom that I could not control. Hey, you're back early. Everything okay? My wife asked as I made my way through the front door. She looked concerned. It hadn't been more than 2 hours since I'd left for work. She knew something was wrong. She was perceptive like that, always seeming to know what I thought, even if I didn't say anything myself. I broke down there and then. Her act of kindness proved too overwhelming for my already taxed emotions. Her face changed to one of pity and worry as I told her everything. Each time I saw the dog, the cafe, the car crash, the garage, everything. She embraced me tightly, the scent of her coconut shampoo filling my nostrils, and for a moment, just a moment, my fears ebbed away. After a few short minutes, she broke away from the embrace, taking a step back and looking me in the eyes. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. That must have been horrible. No wonder your thoughts are all over the place. You should get some rest and try and process what you've seen. She seemed to pause briefly, as though she wanted to say more, weighing up in her mind if it was a good idea. Also, and only if you're okay with it, I can start looking for therapists? You know, to help you deal with it, she said, her eyes filling with genuine care and concern, and worry as to my reaction. At that moment, my heart dropped. She didn't believe me. That is to say, she believed that I'd seen all of the accidents, but she didn't believe that I'd seen that dog, or that it had anything to do with them. She obviously thought I was breaking, unable to deal with what I'd seen. As much as I loved her, and knew that she was only thinking of what was best for me, I couldn't help but feel alone, isolated and helpless. Deflated, I resigned myself to attempting to sleep, telling her I'd think about therapy. Her face eased as I gave my response, settling all the worries that she had. I had no intention of looking into it. I knew what I'd seen, but I knew she'd worry all night if she didn't think I was at least trying to get better. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, but like sand slipping between my fingers, sleep eluded me. I felt so alone, so confused. I needed someone to talk to. A thought flashed through my brain. Something I'd not thought of for a long time. Memories of my uncle. I'd not seen him for years. I couldn't remember him too well, but from what little I could recall, he'd become a bit of an eccentric as he aged. Like a lot of people with too much time and money, he'd gotten into the spiritual and occult, even going as far as performing his own seances and rituals. All of the things that my parents had dismissed as silly or make-believe at one time or another. We'd stopped visiting him a few years after that. I don't know exactly why. All I know is that it followed an incident that happened between him and my parents that they refused to tell me any more about. I in no way believed in anything as mundane as spirits or ghosts. But there was something about this dog, about what happened whenever I saw it. Once or twice, I could chalk that off as a coincidence. But every time I'd seen this thing, someone had died. If there was ever a case for the supernatural existing, this had to be it. It was as good of an explanation as any. I lay there, toying with the idea in my mind, tossing it back and forth, unsure if I should act on it or throw it to the recesses of my mind to gather dust and be forgotten. To hell with it. What do I have to lose? I said out loud to no one in particular. And just like that, it was decided. I would visit my uncle and find out what he may know. Hopefully he'd be able to give me some answers as to what the hell this goddamn thing was or what was going on. I really wish things had turned out differently. That I'd maybe done something differently. But hindsight's always a luxury that comes too late. So I set off early the next morning. The cool country breeze was rippling through my hair as I sped through the forested roads out of town. I'd borrowed my wife's car, winding along the roads that led to my uncle's house. A frail voice had answered the phone when I called, sounding slightly standoffish at first. I thought perhaps I'd got the wrong number, until I explained who I was, and that frail voice seemed to fill with delight, exclaiming how it was good to hear my voice, and that he'd missed seeing me and the rest of my family. He'd invited me over the very same day to catch up, giving me his address and sounding intrigued as I explained that I had a strange issue that he might be able to help with. As I took in the sights and sounds of those country roads, it was the closest I'd come to feeling relaxed ever since the incident with Carl. The rolling fields, thick trees with the sun cresting over them, and quiet empty roads were serene, calming my shot nerves. After several minutes of driving, the tree line shrank back, revealing a large house a short distance away with a narrow gravel road leading up to it. Taking the turning, I made my way up the well-kept road, taking in the meticulously trimmed grass of the fields flanking it. As I approached the large manor house, in awe of the many large windows adorning its brick surface, I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of shameful envy when I thought about my wife and my small two-bedroom house. Still, I couldn't help but be amazed by the place. It was beautiful, and every inch of its outer appearance seemed to be kept as meticulously pristine as the lawns I'd driven past. Pulling up to a stop in the large, cream gravel driveway, I stepped out of my car, unable to tear my eyes away from the place. "So, what do you think?" I heard a voice call out. It was frail, but seemed full of energy. Scanning around for the source of the voice, I looked up. Leaning on the sill of one of the slightly open windows was an older-looking man. His grey hairs were sparse on his head, balding skin visible underneath. A tired expression held his wrinkled face, but vibrant blue eyes were dazzling with the fire of youth beneath its brow. He grinned as he met my gaze. My uncle. I can't believe how much you've grown. Last time I saw you, you were just about able to walk, and look at you now. It's got to have been 25 years. Yes, at least that. My word. You've certainly got the family look about you, that's for sure. His eyes widened in a flash, as though suddenly realizing a pressing matter that had slipped his attention. Look at me, chatting away out of the window while you're standing there. How rude of me. Please, come in, get warm, and we can continue somewhere more comfortable. He raised a wizened hand and gestured towards the door. It's unlocked. I knew you were coming, so just let yourself in, and I'll meet you down in the hall. And with that he was gone, hobbling off past the edge of the window, disappearing completely from view. A little taken aback by the enthusiasm of my uncle, I walked across the crunching gravel path until I stood at the looming, solid oak doors barring the entrance of the manor house. Reaching for the intricate golden handle, my hand hesitated for a second as I felt a sense of nervousness swelling up in me. Yes, this man was my uncle, and yes, he'd seemed excited to see me. But I didn't really know him. I was basically about to walk into a stranger's house. After a second, I shook the thought off. I needed answers, and my uncle seemed like my best bet at the moment. And he was still family after all. I grasped the handle firmly and twisted my wrist to the right, feeling the heavy weight of the solid door as it slowly opened on well-oiled hinges. My jaw dropped again as the interior of the manor became clearly visible. The polished marble floor spread out in all directions, spotless and gleaming. Adorning the beautifully decorated walls were several oil paintings depicting various landscapes. The walls themselves were lined with stone plinths, topped with expensive-looking vases filled with fresh flowers. I felt like I'd walked into an art museum, and for a second, that feeling of envy reared its ugly head again. The light tapping of a walking stick on marble from somewhere above me grabbed my attention. I looked to the top of the large staircase to see my uncle standing there, waving to me, gesturing for me to come to him. Although I'd seen him when he spoke to me from the window, I'd only managed to see his face and torso. The rest of him had been obscured by the walls of the manor. Now that he was standing before me, I could clearly see the extent of his frail frame. He was a taller man, even with the natural stoop that seemed to come with age. He looked like all of the decisions of his lifetime had weighed heavily on him. A green velvet housecoat covered the majority of his sickly frame, draped over his thin limbs like a coat on a rack. Still, his aging body and paper skin did not seem to slow him down. He was grinning that same genuine smile as I closed the door behind me and began to ascend the stairs towards him. "My boy, it's so good to see you again," he said, taking my hand and excitedly shaking it. His grip was impressive for someone of his years. It felt like the handshake of a much younger man. "This way, follow me. My study will be a more comfortable place for us to catch up, and to discuss the matter that you mentioned." And before I could utter a word, he turned on his heel and was making his way down the corridor with impressive speed, his walking stick clicking loudly against the marble floor with each step. I had to set off at a slight jog to catch up to him, and even then I was having to put in a great deal of effort just to maintain pace. As we walked through a couple of winding corridors of the manor, my uncle proceeded to ask me a myriad of questions about my life, as though he was trying to fit 25 years worth of lost time into the short walk. He was part of the way through regaling me with a tale from his youth, when he stopped dead outside of another large oak door. "Here we are," he said, and pushed the door open, to reveal the room beyond. His study was as beautifully decorated as the rest of the manor. However, there were more creature comforts added to this room. Large rugs adorned the marble floor, housing a writing desk along with 2 large plump armchairs positioned on either side of a large hearth. Come, grab yourself a seat and I'll get the fire going," he said, ushering me into one of the larger chairs before sliding over to the hearth and messing with the mass of logs that filled it. Within a few moments, he jumped back with a start, the erupting flames licking what remained of his thinning hair, before chuckling to himself about his close call. "That's one way to do it," he exclaimed. Then, making his way to his writing desk, he grabbed a large crystal decanter filled with a golden brown liquid and proceeded to measure out a small amount into 2 crystal glasses. Looking around the room, I couldn't help but wonder what it was my uncle had done for a job. My parents had probably told me before, but I couldn't for the life of me remember. They were right about one thing though. He was odd. Harmless enough, but odd. Passing one of the glasses to me, he proceeded to sit in the other large chair opposite mine, sinking into it as though being slowly absorbed. "I know you drove here, but one can't hurt," he said, smiling at me and gesturing to the glass before taking a large swig of his. For several hours we sat there, telling each other about our lives and expressing how sorry we were that we'd not seen each other for so many years. I'd explained how my parents said we weren't allowed to see him anymore after whatever it was that had happened all those years ago. As I said this, I could see my uncle's face visibly flush, and he sheepishly responded, "Ah, yes. Well, I can't exactly blame them, but I do miss them both dearly. You will tell them that when you next see them, won't you?" A part of me desperately wanted to know what it was that had gone on. What could possibly have driven such a wedge between them? But from the way my uncle had reacted, I could tell it wasn't a subject that he would feel comfortable exploring. At least, not yet. A momentary lull in the conversation followed, as my uncle's eyes seemed to drift to some faraway place. After a few seconds, they focused again, as though he'd snapped himself out of the haze of memory that he'd just been trapped in. "Anyway, enough about all that. You came to me because you said you needed my help. I'm flattered, but what exactly could I help you with that no one else could? Forgive me for saying this, and please don't think I'm ungrateful, but it must be something significant for you to reach out to me after all these years." He fixed me with his youthful eyes, expectant and eager to help. It was at that moment I became aware of exactly how stupid I'd felt. I'd reached out to him, driven all the way here, worried him into thinking something horrific was going to happen, and now I was going to tell him about some strange thing that's happened with a dog that I'd found. I was almost questioning if I should go ahead with it, if I should just apologize for wasting his time and leave instead. With his expectant gaze filled on me the whole time, I decided to bite the bullet. What was the worst that could happen? I proceeded to tell him about the dog, about everything that had happened, bracing myself for the hysterical laughter I was sure would follow. As I relayed my story, his expression seemed to morph from inquisitive to curious, and finally to one of deep concern as every last detail of the past few weeks was laid out in front of him. As the last words left my lips, I was aware of a warm sensation running down my face. Tears. I'd been so caught up reliving the details that I didn't even realize I'd been crying. This was the first time I'd actually tried to process anything that I'd seen over the last few weeks. My uncle pulled a handkerchief from the top pocket of his housecoat, gently handing it to me, gesturing for me to take it with a comforting smile on his face. "My boy, that sounds just awful indeed," he said. "I'm so sorry you're going through this, and I'm going to try my damned hardest to help in whatever way I can." I appreciated his kind words, and for a moment, I let myself feel like perhaps he actually would be able to help me. Maybe he'd be able to figure out what this dog was, figure out a way to stop it. But with that thought, a cold washed over me. What if he found something that was the opposite? Something that proved the dog wasn't real, that it was all in my head, that I was going mad. I had no idea what he could have told me to prove that, but it scared me all the same. Now I can see why you came to me. Your parents no doubt mentioned my spiritual interests, I assume. As he mentioned my parents, he seemed to drift off slightly again, before regaining his composure and returning to his train of thought. Well, from what you've told me, it does sound otherworldly. Of that I'm certain. What I'm not certain of is what exactly it is. There are a few categories it fits into, he continued. I could tell he was thinking hard, practically hearing the rusting cogs of his aged mind turning, scouring through a lifetime's worth of knowledge. Things like omens. You know, signs that show up just before something bad happens, like war, disease, or death. Throughout history, people have seen omens at several different times. However, they only normally appear to a person once. They don't tend to follow them around. And then there's the case of its changing appearance, he said, trailing off again. He sat there for what felt like hours, racking his brain in the silence of the study. The only sound was that of the crackling fire as the logs popped and snapped in the heat. After some time, he turned to face me, a saddened, defeated expression on his face. I'm sorry, my boy. I can't think of any such creature that I'm aware of. Although there's one thing I'm certain of. Based on its pattern and its behaviour, it's not a benevolent entity. He looked me dead in the eyes, and what he said next sent a chill running through me. You need to be careful. Things of that nature, once they latch onto something or someone, they don't tend to go away. I thought about each time I'd seen that dog, and the deaths that seemed to shortly follow. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I shivered despite the warmth of the fire as I imagined it following me, latching on, tethered to me for some unknown sinister purpose. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was already too late. Sensing my darkening thoughts, my uncle grabbed his walking stick and struggled from the comfort of his armchair to his feet. Looking down at me, he uttered one sentence, "Come this way," before he began to march to the door with that same unnatural speed, suddenly vanishing around its corner. Slumping out of the chair, I got to my feet, forcing myself to follow. I dragged my feet slightly as I walked. This had been a disaster. I came here for answers, but I was still none the wiser. If anything, I was more scared than I had been last night. We walked along another marbled corridor, passing a few more large oaken doors, before coming to a stop in front of another. Gently turning the handle and allowing it to swing open, my uncle stepped inside, beckoning me to follow. My eyes met with the sight of books, shelves upon shelves of books. They lined the walls, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. There wasn't an inch of the large open space before me that wasn't covered. It was truly an impressive sight. Had I not been reeling from the idea that the dog was a monstrous, evil entity that was latching itself to me, but then I would have been truly amazed. I can't promise it'll be quick. It might take me a few weeks, heck, even a few months, but I'll search through everything I have. One of these has to have some answers, something that sounds familiar, something to help at least, he said, turning his head and scanning his eyes across the wall of tomes before me, a genuine expression of pity and sadness on his face. I'm just sorry I can't do more. I couldn't believe it. Here was this man, old and frail, not having seen his nephew for over 25 years, who then came to him with the strangest story he'd heard for a while, and he was willing to do whatever he could for this person he hardly knew. I couldn't help a smile rising to my face, even less so the tears forming in my eyes. For the first time in such a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like things might actually start turning around. Like I might finally get some answers. Thank you. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me, I said, fighting back the cracking of my voice that threatened to spill over into a full-blown crying fit. Just then, a shrill ding from my pocket drew my attention. It was a text from my wife, asking how much longer I think I'll be as she's starting dinner soon. Checking the time, I jumped with a start. In all of the catching up and discussion, I'd lost track of time. Turning to my uncle, it was as though he was able to read my thoughts somehow, saying, "My goodness, look at the time. No doubt your wife will be wondering where you are. Please, don't worry, you'd best get going. I'll let you know as soon as I find anything." He started making his way back to the main hall again, the sound of his walking stick clacking along the marble corridor. Gratefully, I followed him, the thoughts of our meeting now swirling along with the oppressive thoughts from before, banishing them from my mind. Things were really going to start getting better. I could feel it. I stopped at the large, oak double doors, opening them with ease, revealing the beautifully kept driveway beyond. "Thank you for today, my boy. It's not often I get visitors anymore. Not ones that aren't trying to sell me something, at least." I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed having company. A wave of melancholy spread across his face as he spoke. "I'll let you know as soon as I have anything that could help." He paused for a second, before saying, "You will come and visit me again, won't you? It would be good to see you. You're more than welcome to bring your lovely wife with you next time as well. I would so very much like to meet her." Although he tried his best to hide it, his tone betrayed a hint of desperation. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pity rising. This kindly old man was willing to help me, to listen to my crazy story and actually help me. He'd asked for nothing in return, just company. I clasped his frail old hand in mine and shook it firmly, looking him in the eyes as I told him that I would most definitely return. I'd bring my wife with me and we could all stop for dinner. His eyes seemed to light up with gratitude and a soft smile spread across his face. As I released his hand and stepped into the driveway, I thanked him once again. Making my way across the fine gravel to my car, I opened the door and sat myself inside. I couldn't help but almost feel relaxed. The most relaxed I'd been for weeks. Starting the engine, I turned the car around with ease in the spacious driveway. Looking back, I waved one last goodbye to my uncle as I began to make my way down the path towards the main road. In my rearview mirror, I could see him return it before making his way back inside and closing those large double doors. The car trundled along the path as I took in the serene, beautifully maintained surroundings once again. That place really did seem idyllic, especially the view of the rolling hills in the distance, beyond the hedges bordering the house. Just as I was staring off, admiring the view, something caught my eye. It was only brief, but I swear I saw something moving. Only slightly, just beyond the hedge. An eerie feeling seemed to creep along my spine, climbing towards my scalp, although I couldn't place why. It ate away the happy, relaxed feelings I'd been enjoying not 10 minutes ago, until I felt the same as I had for the past several weeks. As I started to round the corner, the movement from the hedge returned. I'd definitely seen it this time, unobscured now that my car was just rounding the gate. All I could do was stare numbly at the source of it, fumbling blindly for the brakes, slamming to a halt as my mind tried to process the sight before me. That creeping, eerie feeling that had crawled through me now seemed to intensify in the milky white of the clouded eyes that stared at me. That dog. Sitting there on the grass verge, just in front of the hedgerow, was the same misty-eyed creature that had been haunting my nightmares for several weeks now. Its gaze was fixed on me, the eyes giving me that same feeling that there was something else watching me from behind them. Sitting on the verge, it wagged its tail, as though eager to see me. It was definitely the same dog, only now its fur was much less matted, looking healthier, even glossy in places. Its frame was bulkier than before now, actual muscle visible beneath its skin, as opposed to the sinew and bone that it had been composed of on our first meeting. What the hell was it doing here? We were miles out from town. It had taken me an hour to drive here, and that was in a car. There was no way it would have been able to follow me all of the way out here. And the chances of it wandering out this way on its own were laughable. What did it want? Why did it keep following me? All of these questions reeled around in my head as I stared, slack-jawed, at the creature inexplicably sat in front of me. I just couldn't believe it. Then, the sound of my uncle's voice bubbled its way up, overpowering the spiralling questions, bringing with it a creeping dread that threatened to consume me. Once they latch onto something, or someone, they don't tend to go away. Was he right? Had this thing latched onto me already? Was it going to follow me wherever I went, always appearing just around a corner, no matter how far I ran? The dread and desperation that loomed over me seemed to come crashing down as these thoughts repeated over and over. Why me? Why couldn't it just leave me alone? Go and choose someone else? I looked up again into those milky white eyes as they stared into me, looking like they didn't belong to it. As I stared, the fear and desperation began to evolve, growing and writhing into a blistering sea of rage. It had latched onto me. I'd make it regret it. I'd make it leave me alone, make it go away. I just wanted to be left alone. I wanted everything to go back to normal. Opening the car door and standing at my full height, I frantically scanned around for something nearby. Anything at all that I could use as a makeshift weapon. Spying a large stick near the base of the nearest hedge, I grasped it firmly in my hand, testing the weight before charging at the dog. I screamed at the top of my lungs, releasing all of my terror and anger. I was yelling so loudly that I'm sure it would be echoing for miles around, scaring any animals nearby back into their lairs. The dog's expression turned to one of fear, and for a moment, I almost allowed myself to feel pity for it. Its eyes were the only thing that stopped me. The dead, milky eyes were still emanating that unnatural feeling as they drilled into me. The fear in the creature's face was no way reflected in those horrible eyes, as though it was just a mask. As I closed the distance, it turned and fled, yelping as it vanished into the undergrowth of a nearby field. Roaring in frustration, I held the stick with two hands, watching as it flew through the air towards the place that the dog had been. The frantic rustling of the undergrowth seemed to grow distant as the dog fled, before it vanished entirely, and I was left standing in the middle of the road, alone. As the fury that had taken hold of me seemed to slowly ebb away, I became aware of my own haggard breathing, sounding like an injured animal. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears like a thundering drum. Looking down at my hands, they were visibly shaking, and I felt weak in my knees. Shakily, I started to make my way back along the road to my car. I'd done it though. I'd chased it off. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that would be all it took. Maybe it would leave me alone now. I'd hopefully know for sure once my uncle found a bit more about it. Stopping dead, I nearly collapsed on my already shaking legs as the strength that remained was ripped violently away with a sudden realization. My uncle. Mustering all of the energy that I could, I frantically ran back up the gravel driveway, passing my car by in a blur of movement. My vision tunneled as my eyes fixed on the large oak doors at the entrance of the manor. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I needed to get to the doors, and get there as fast as I could. My mind was going a mile a minute, thoughts competing for their brief moment in the spotlight, clambering over one another in a writhing mass. My legs burned with each step, screaming with the strain I was exerting on them. Still, it felt as though I was running through treacle. All the while the door only inching closer until, with a heavy slam, I collided with it, bursting through it and tumbling into a pile on the cold marble floor. My screams echoed, bouncing around the large decorated halls, as my eyes locked with the blue, strangled face lying on the floor before me. Purple veins snaked their way across the cold surface that was once the face of my uncle. He was lying on his front, inches away from me, his face looking up towards the door in a mask of abject terror and pain. Thick white foam lined the edges of his cold, thin lips, leaking down before pooling on the velvet of his housecoat. His thin, wispy hair was sprawled out in several directions, frantic and panicked. But the worst part was his eyes. The ones I'd seen as soon as I fell through the door. Those eyes had etched themselves into my memory forever. My uncle's eyes, so youthful and caring, were gone. The eyes that met mine were cold, dead and milky white. Even in this unmoving, unblinking state, it felt as if they were drilling into me, their cold gaze causing an eerie feeling to crawl through me, mingling with my fear and grief. I crawled backwards, slipping across the marble floor, trying to get away from the corpse in front of me. All the while my uncle's lifeless eyes seemed to follow me, watching me fumbling away. The sudden, solid plaster of the walls met my back as I came to a halt, trapping me. I broke down, tears rolling from my eyes before streaming down my face. I'd known my uncle for less than a day, and now he was dead, all because of me. If I'd never shown up here, if I'd never come for him to help, then the dog would never have followed me, and he would still be alive. This was all my fault. My vision blurred by my tears, I took my phone with shaking hands and called for the emergency services. The operator asked me the usual questions, and I must have answered her, but my mind was too fixated on what had happened to remember what was said. All I could think was about how I was responsible for all this. I'd killed my uncle. Even if I hadn't done it myself, it was still my fault. The milky white orbs of his eyes were still staring out from the blue of his face, looking into me, filling me with an unbearable sense of guilt. The feeling of loneliness washed over me again as I realized that the only person who had believed me, the only person who'd wanted to help, was gone. I was alone again, alone and at the mercy of that dog. It had found me, even here, so far away from town where I'd seen it before. Exhausted by the grief I was feeling, my head collapsed into my hands, shuddering with the chilling realization that wherever I went, this thing would probably follow. I don't know how long I sat there like that, tears dripping into a small pool as they leaked from my hands onto the marble floor. Time ceased to mean anything, and all of my senses grew numb. After some time, I became aware of sounds around me. People shouting. Someone crouching, speaking to me. I didn't look up. Couldn't. I couldn't look into the face of my uncle again. Someone helped me to my feet, taking me outside and into the cool air before sitting me down on the back of an ambulance and wrapping me in a blanket. Although my body was present, it was like I was watching everything unfold through a distorted lens. the people bustling around mere blurry shapes with no defined features. One such shape was standing to my left, asking me several questions. I could hear the sound of my own voice answering him, hear words coming out of my mouth, but my conscious brain had no part in them. I just couldn't tear my eyes away from the double doors leading to the manor. Several shapes were exiting, clad in blurry green. They were pushing another shape between them, large and grey, rolling on wheels. Something was lining the top, buried underneath a white sheet. I couldn't look away as I watched them wheel the trolley towards the ambulance, before lifting it in and vanishing from view, closing the doors behind them. The police officer, obviously seeing how devastated I was by what I'd witnessed this afternoon, gave me his sympathies before telling me that he would likely be in touch again and not to leave town. I don't remember if I even acknowledged him as he said goodbye before getting into his car and vanishing along the gravel road along with the ambulance, their crimson taillights refracting into long trails through my tears. Then I was alone again, in the slowly darkening driveway, alone with my thoughts and my guilt. I don't remember driving home. All that I can remember are the whirling questions that spun around in my mind. What if it's me? What if I'm somehow making this dog appear and these people die? I had no idea how it would be possible. But then, I had no idea how people dying when the dog appeared was possible either. I was the only one who seemed to be able to see this thing. My boss had thought I was going crazy, and the people by the other accidents hadn't seen a trace of it, although it should have passed right by them. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility that it was somehow responding specifically to me. But then again, because no one else had seen it, all of this could still be in my head. There was no evidence that the dog was actually real, only that I'd somehow been in the vicinity of 4 people around the time that they died. Once they latch onto something, or someone, they don't tend to go away. That sentence rang around in my head again, worming its way to the surface. If it was real, was it even a dog? How did it choose to appear? My thoughts whirled as they began to take a darker turn. Why had it chosen to appear now, today? Had it decided to kill my uncle? Because he offered to help me? Was it worried that he would succeed? The dog's form appeared in my thoughts. That same sack of taut skin and bones clad with matted tangled fur that it had been when I first encountered it. Its glassy white eyes stared forward as it began to slowly morph, its frame filling out, its fur becoming more glossy and clean, until it resembled the dog I'd seen on the road earlier today. How was it changing each time I saw it? How had it gone from the near-dead whelp that I'd first seen to the near-perfect specimen of a dog it was now? It always seemed to change after an accident, like they were transforming it somehow, strengthening it. I tried to shake myself free from the cascading waves of my thoughts, trying to think of anything else that might take my mind away for 2 seconds. Images of my wife floated up in my mind. Claire, bringing temporary relief from the oppressive thoughts. I thought about our wedding day, me in my suit, her in her flowing white dress, smiling from ear to ear. And for a moment, I felt the stirrings of a peaceful calm in my head. As the image of Claire spun around, the shaggy form of the dog appeared in my memory, dragging my thoughts back to the oppressive dread that I'd so desperately been trying to escape. What if this thing appeared at my home, when Claire was there? What if it decided to take her too? A cold slithered through me as I imagined its pale, dead eyes staring at me as my wife collapsed in the next room. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. I didn't know what I could do. All I knew is that I would do anything in my power to keep her safe. I don't know what it was that pulled my attention from the maelstrom of thoughts. If it was the sound of the other cars, the familiar sight of my street, or the sounds of children playing in the distance. All I knew was that somehow, even with my thoughts writhing like a mass of agitated insects, I'd driven myself home. I was cruising along my street, nearly at the door to my house. Looking back at it now, it's a miracle that I didn't kill anyone with how little attention I've been paying on the road. As the car powered along, bringing me ever closer to my destination, I looked around with a newfound awareness. The street, once a calm, secure sight, filled me with dread. I looked at each of the houses, noting all of the tight spots and hidden corners, expecting some kind of furry tail to be wagging just out of sight. If that dog was following me, it could be hiding anywhere, waiting for me. A jolt of fear ran through me, cold and icy, as I saw the movement of something by the side of one of my neighbour's houses. It couldn't be here, could it? Not again. Not so soon after I last saw it. I couldn't bear to look. I wasn't strong enough to go through that again. But I needed to know. Forcing myself to turn my eyes over to the side of that house again, I looked, all the while expecting to see the cloudy, wet orbs of the dog's eyes staring back at me in the distance. I let out the breath I'd been holding as relief swam through me. It was a dog, but it was completely different. A border collie, someone's pet. Its black and white coat darted around the garden, chasing a flock of birds flying overhead. My heart was beating a mile a minute as I tried to calm myself. Sure, it wasn't there this time, but there's nothing to say it wouldn't be hiding around the next corner. Focusing my gaze forward, I continued driving, not looking at the streets on either side of me for fear of the glassy white eyes that could be waiting for me anywhere. I needed to get home, to get to Claire. I'd be safe there, I thought, although a nagging part of me questioned how I could possibly know that for sure. My gaze was still fixed on the road in front of the car as I slowed to a crawl and gently turned into my driveway. It was dark now, the beams of my headlights illuminating the outside of the house in their warm glow. Coming to a stop and turning off the engine, I stepped out, the weight of my limbs threatening to pull me to the ground. I was exhausted, running on empty. I didn't know how much longer I could go on like this. Making my way to the door, I fumbled with the key in the lock before it finally connected and turned with a click. Trying to put on my best attempt at a composed face, I stepped into the house. I knew Claire was still worried about me from last night, so seeing me like this would only make things worse. Closing and locking the door behind me, I could hear footsteps in the kitchen getting closer. Finally, you're back. Dinner's ready. I'm just plating. The porcelain dish filled with pasta that she was holding filled the air with a tinkling sound as it fell from her hands to the ground, shattering. Oblivious to the bolognese sauce now spreading across the floor, she ran to me, embracing me and asking me what had happened. I broke down in her arms again, for the second time in as many days, and cried harder than I ever thought I could. I explained about my uncle, explained about that dog again, and then what I'd seen in the manor when I ran through those doors. The eyes seemed to stare out through my memory, as though still looking into me. Her composure finally broke when I told her how it had been my fault, how that thing was obviously following me, how it wouldn't have killed him if he hadn't offered to help me. I knew how insane I sounded, how unbelievable this all was. But I didn't care. I just needed someone to know what was happening, someone to understand. She took care of me for the rest of that evening, sitting with me and stroking my hair in an attempt to calm me. She hardly ever left my side, only to get me a drink or some food. I think she was worried about what I might do if she wasn't around. Either way, I appreciated it. In the days that followed, I didn't leave the house. I couldn't bring myself to. That thing was still out there, waiting for me, where I least expected it. And if I stayed in here, then that harbinger of death wouldn't be able to kill anyone else because of me. As long as it couldn't get to me, then everyone would be safe. If only it had been that simple. The morning after my uncle's death, Claire and I got into a heated argument as I begged her not to leave the house. I couldn't let her go, not with that thing likely waiting just outside, waiting for her. I'd be condemning her to death. She was adamant that she would be fine, much to my dismay. After a lengthy back and forth argument, she brought up something I hadn't thought of. I was the only one who seemed to be able to see it, and people only seemed to die whenever I saw it. So if she couldn't see it, and I couldn't see it, then she would be fine. I could tell she was humouring me with this argument, going along with me because she was worried about me, rather than actually believing that there was actually a dog. Still, I couldn't help but admit she made a good point. Maybe it needed me. If other people couldn't see it, then maybe it couldn't do anything, or hurt anyone, unless I was there. As I was pondering this new thought, her shout of, "I'll be back in half an hour, I love you," floated to me with the closing of the front door. And just like that she was gone, into the outside, into what could very well be the waiting gaze of that dog. I stared blankly at the door, my heart sinking into my stomach. Time seemed to pass at a snail's pace as I wandered the house on my own, terrified as to what would happen to my wife without me there to protect her. But equally terrified as to what might happen to her if I was there and we saw that dog. My heart was beating out through my chest. I could hear the blood rushing through my eardrums. I couldn't help but feel sick, constantly glancing back towards the door, waiting for any sign of her to come back. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to her, especially if it was something that I could have stopped by just not letting her go outside. I kept going back to what she'd said, about how the dog only appeared for me. It was the only thing I could cling to keep myself from going insane. The minutes seemed to stretch on as I tried my best to busy myself, to take my mind away to somewhere else. I'd cleaned the kitchen in the hopes that the monotonous tasks would preoccupy me, but now the spotless surfaces glinted back at me, and I was left in that same desperate state, alone with my thoughts. At a loss as to what to do to distract my mind from worrying, I was about to go into the living room to watch TV, boot up my PlayStation. I wasn't entirely sure, when a sound from the front door drew my attention back to the hall. My spirits immediately rose as I thought of Claire turning her key in the lock and pushing the door open, arms filled with shopping. My heart skipped a beat as the giddy feeling of relief filled me. Thank God she was safe. She was right, there was nothing to worry about. Elated, I began making my way along the hallway that led to the front door, ready to help her with the bags. When the sound came again, though, a sickening wave crashed over me as my stomach dropped and I realised what it was. It was a faint noise, barely audible, but still, it seemed to drown out everything else around me. Coming from the bottom of the door, although faint, it was unmistakable. The scratching of dulled claws against wood, like something gently pawing at the barrier that separated me and it. I stared at it, numb, as the sound continued. The relief that had welled up in me mere moments ago seeped away as the scratching increased in its intensity. It was coming more rapidly now, frantic and heavy. With abject terror, I realised what it was. The dog. It had to be. It was pawing at the door from the other side of the door, trying to get to me. It was here. How had it found me? Then again, if it was somehow tethered to me, and had found me several other times in far more obscure places, I shouldn't have been surprised. But still, that didn't change the fact that it was here, at my front door. The illusion of safety that my home had provided me was shattering around me with each pawing scratch, and I slowly realised that nowhere was safe. I'd never be able to escape. There was nowhere I could go where it wouldn't find me. My mind was reeling. But the one thought forcing its way through, shouting above all the others, was to close my eyes. If that thing had found me, every time I saw it, someone died. Maybe if I didn't look at it, that would stop it? It was a long shot, but what else could I do? I scrunched my eyes up tightly, causing dark clouds to swirl in the blackness that followed, and turned my back to the door. The scratching was getting louder now, and even more relentless, as whatever was on the other side of the door seemed to be trying its hardest to dig its way through the solid door. I couldn't stand it. Those scratching noises echoing around in my head, bouncing around in the darkness. I covered my ears to block out the sounds of impending death. I felt so vulnerable, deprived of my two main senses. The space around me felt alien and hostile, like there could be anything standing there in the darkness, inches from me, inches from my closed eyes, and I would never know until it was too late. Sinking to the ground, I clutched my knees to my chest as I balled into the fetal position, unsure of what else to do. I was trapped by those terrible sounds from the door, unable to open my eyes for fear of the thing that lay beyond it, waiting for me. All I could do was lay there. If the dog managed to get in, it wouldn't matter where I hid. It would still find me. I couldn't escape. Hot tears streamed down my cheeks before dripping to the floor as I burst into helpless tears. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't spend the rest of my life hiding from that thing, jumping at the slightest sound, expecting to see milky white eyes staring back at me. There was no way I could live, making sure that there was always some kind of barrier between me and it. If I slipped up, even once, then it would mean that I'd killed someone. It would be on me, and the guilt of that would be too much for me to bear. Just then, the muffled sound of the pawing seemed to stop, leaving me lying on the ground in empty silence. Slowly, trembling, I lowered my shaking hands from my ears, as though daring that terrible noise to start up again. Pausing for a second, I strained my ears for any indication that that thing was still there. Nothing. Maybe it had gone. Given up? I began to breathe out a deep sigh of relief, slowly starting to relax slightly as I imagined the dog slinking away, defeated by the door. I was just getting to my feet when another, more insidious sound suddenly met my ears, and that sense of relief was viciously stripped away. The soft click of the door latch. My eyes were still tightly shut. All I could do was lay there, terrified as I processed that sound. It had opened the door. How the hell had it opened the locked door? It was a dog. Then again, it wasn't like anything about this dog made any sense. All I could do was lay there, trembling, as I heard soft, light footsteps begin to slowly make their way into the hallway towards me. The hot tears were now flowing down my face in a steady stream as I visualized the dog in my mind, slowly crossing the threshold of my front door, taking slow, deliberate steps, gradually closing the distance between us. All the while its glassy stare was fixed on me, waiting, begging me to look at it. I closed my eyes tighter, bringing my hands up in a desperate attempt to stop even the slightest glimpse of that creature from getting through. I could hear its footsteps now, They were louder, as though they were only inches away. They were getting closer and closer, each one causing more and more panic to spread through me in pulsating jolts. I was trapped, helpless. There was nothing I could do. If I tried to run, it would undoubtedly follow me, waiting for me to drop my guard, to open my eyes, even a sliver, and then it would be too late. All I could do was lay there, hoping that somehow, something would save me. Then, as abruptly as they'd started, the steps stopped. There was a cold silence that rocked me as I realized the dog was probably standing just in front of me now, its gaze fixed on my face, waiting. Everything was silent other than the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. Just as I was imagining the dog watching me, I felt something cold press gently against my shoulder. My skin crawled as though in retreat from the foreign presence now touching it, and I cried out, unable to maintain my composure anymore. Hey, it's me. What's going on? Are you okay? Breaking through the cloud of fear like a blinding light, Claire's voice met my ears. She moved her cold hand away before embracing me in a tight hug as I sat there on the floor, exhausted and terrified. She was back. She was safe. The dog hadn't taken her. That thought flooded through me, filling me with warmth as I listened to the sounds of her voice, somehow muffled through the fog of my thoughts. Still, I refused to open my eyes. What if it hadn't left before she'd got back? What if it had followed her through the door and was sitting there in front of me? She wouldn't know. How could she? She couldn't see it. There was no way I could risk it. I wouldn't do that to her. I wouldn't kill her. Even if it meant I had to keep my eyes closed forever, I would do it. Still feeling her warm embrace, her voice was becoming clearer, asking me what happened. Between sobs, I explained everything, my breath catching in my throat. The scratching, the latch, the footsteps. The footsteps. There had only been one set of footsteps after the door latch had opened. My mind began whirring. My wife was here with me, so if the dog had followed her in, then surely there would have been sounds of another, different set of footsteps getting closer. One for her and one for the dog. I strained my ears again, listening for any sounds beside my wife. The sounds of breathing or panting from anywhere in the room. Any sign of another presence that could be hiding in plain sight. There was nothing. The hallway was silent other than the sounds of my wife and my rattling breath between sobs. It had to be safe, didn't it? Slowly, ever so slowly, I relaxed my clenched eyelids, allowing them to part slightly. The hallway's light flooded my vision, bringing with it the blurry outlines and shapes of my surroundings. I could just about make out Claire, crouched and hugging me, merging into the bright yellow of her raincoat. I could see the floor, empty other than Claire and me, stretching on further away from me. As far as I could tell, there was nothing else nearby other than that same furniture that had always been there, much to my relief. Over her shoulder, I could make out the blurry outline of the rest of the hallway, leading to the now closed door. It was all empty, devoid of any signs of life. Relief washed over me as I realized that it wasn't there. There was no sign of it anywhere. We were safe. I think I broke down again after that, but more with happiness than anything else. I was just so relieved that nothing had happened, that the dog had left me alone. I hugged my wife tighter, relieved and disbelieving, before she helped me up from the floor and into the living room. Little did I know that this was only the first true test of my sanity. In the weeks that followed, I was tested with an ever-increasing frequency. I would catch small, insidious glimpses of fur moving around behind the bushes in my back garden. As soon as I caught sight of it, I clamped my eyes shut as tightly as I could and stumbled out of the room, away from the window. Each time the panic and fear that I'd felt in the hallway would come crashing back as I realised that the dog was out there. It was definitely waiting, just biding its time until I slipped up. Other times, I'd hear that pawing at the door again. It was always faint, but it seemed like wherever I was I could hear it, no matter how far away I moved from the door. It never got any quieter, following me like it was coming from inside my mind. Whenever it happened, I instinctively shut my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to will it away. But it never seemed to be enough. No matter how hard I hoped, the scratching would continue like an itch, gnawing at my brain, one that I just couldn't scratch. Then, as quickly as it had started, it would stop, and I would be left awkwardly standing in the eerie silence that followed. The overwhelming fear that the dog was still somewhere outside, still waiting, would run through my mind, clouding my thoughts. It was impossible to get into anything that even remotely resembled a relaxed state. The worst of it, though, the hardest part of all of this, is what it did at night. Mine and Claire's bedroom was on the second floor of our house. It looked out over our garden and the houses beyond. We lived in quite a quiet area, so any sounds, even from a few houses over, could be heard pretty well, especially at night. With that in mind, one night I awoke to a sound that sent a chill trickling through me. My eyes snapped open, and I slowly shook off the stupor of slumber. Wiping the sleep from my eyes, I strained my ears, trying to focus on the sounds that had awoken me. It had been an eerie, high-pitched noise that seemed to pierce my ears, jarring me awake with a jolt. As I lay there in the dark, listening, I slowly began to come around more and more until I was able to place it. The cold chill that had run through me seemed to again crawl down my spine as I understood what I was hearing. It was a dog. Somewhere outside came the frantic, saddening cries of a dog. The high-pitched whining seemed to echo through the night, bouncing around the silent houses. It sounded pitiful, almost painful. In any normal situation, I would have felt sorry for the poor creature outside. But there was something about the throaty, wheezing quality to it that made me feel sick. I had no idea where the sound was coming from, but I couldn't help imagining that mangy dog again. It was probably sitting there, below my bedroom window, looking up with its milky eyes, while crying that mocking, pained cry, just begging me to come and look at it. It would be staring up and waiting for me to open the window, waiting for me to look at it, and then it would get whatever it was that it wanted. It seemed to go on, unrelenting in tone and volume. With each high-pitched whine, it was like a jolt of terror shooting through me, running along my nerves and culminating in a pit in my stomach. I lay there for what felt like hours, completely still. The darkness of the near-pitch black room began pressing in on me, suffocating me with that awful sound, until, finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Turning to Claire, I shook her awake. She murmured something under her breath as sleep was torn away from her. Her half-open eyes whirled around before landing on me. Huh? What's wrong? she said, slurring slightly as the muscles of her mouth were still yet to wake up. Shh! Can you hear that? I said, gesturing to the window in the darkness. She seemed to sober up as she heard the terror in my voice. Straightening up, I watched as she strained her ears, listening for any sounds. The high-pitched cries of the dogs seemed louder now, far louder than they had been when I first awoke. It was as though they were coming from directly beneath the window. It was maddening. Sitting in the darkness, I watched the dark shape that was my wife, sitting there as another bout of those high-pitched cries began. That! Did you hear that? I asked frantically. Claire began, and my heart sank as I knew what she was about to say. I was hoping, beyond hope, that she'd hear it, that the sound had been coming from a dog somewhere in the street, a real dog. But I knew in that moment of hesitation that she hadn't heard anything, that I was the only one that could hear those god-awful sounds. The feeling of isolation and helplessness that crashed down upon me at that moment, amplified by the suffocating darkness of our bedroom, was too much for me to bear. I burst into tears again, much to Claire's dismay. I couldn't help it. I couldn't go on like this. That dog was tormenting me. It knew. It knew that I couldn't stay cooped up in this house forever, that eventually I'd need to leave. All it had to do was to wait there, to outlast me, and then it would get what it wanted. I was trapped, helpless, a prisoner in my own home. Try as I might, sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. I lay there, awake, staring at the ceiling. Claire had long since gone back to sleep after I assured her that I was okay, her heavy breathing the only sound that met my ears between the insidious crying from outside. But how could I ever be okay again? That crying was still there, echoing around in my head, until the thin light of the morning sun slithered through the blinds, seeming to banish the sounds to memory. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I just couldn't sleep. I dreaded to think of what new torture the creature outside would think up for me if I did. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that the dog just left me alone after that, that it got bored. But this continued, intermittently, for several nights. Sometimes it sounded like the dog was just beneath the window. Other times it sounded more distant, but it was assuredly there, singing its terrible, mocking song of howls and whines that only I could hear. The sleepless nights that came with it began to take their toll on me. I became a shell of my former self, the bags that sat heavily underneath my eyes having only developed since this started. My appetite was non-existent, with the thought of eating being one of the farthest things from my mind. As a result, I'd lost I don't know how much weight. My clothes, once tight-fitting, now hung loosely from me, draping my meagre frame. My hair had grown longer and unkempt, exacerbating my dishevelled appearance. Claire was worried about me, but there was nothing she could do for me. Nothing that would help anyway. She tried her best to get me to eat, even going as far as to call the doctors on my behalf in an attempt to get me an appointment with a mental health specialist. I didn't go, of course. There's no way I could have left the house without seeing the dog. I knew that now. It would probably be waiting there, just outside the door. And then came the call. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, trying to block out the scratching sound from the front door that only I could hear, when Claire's phone rang. She looked at it, a confused expression playing across her face, before she answered it. "Hi, Jessica, how are you?" My ears pricked up as I heard the name, and I began to feel uneasy. Jessica was Claire's sister, and although they were by no means on bad terms, she only ever seemed to call with bad news. I watched as Claire's face seemed to drop like a stone, as Jessica must have relayed the reason for her calling. What felt like an hour passed in near-deathly silence, broken only by the occasional, "Uh-huh," and "Okay," from Claire, before she nodded her head, saying, "Okay, no problem, I'll be right there." She hung up her phone, sliding it back into her pocket as she got to her feet. "Everything okay?" I asked, knowing deep down that it most likely wasn't. "It's my mom. She's taken a turn again. Jessica's been looking after her for the past few days, but she can't tonight as her work are being funny about it," she said, beginning to gather up a few items and place them into an overnight bag. "I'm going over there to look after her tonight. Don't worry, I'll be back tomorrow." I balked, the thought of being on my own tonight filling me with dread as I imagined the haunting cries of that dog. Having Claire next to me helped to keep me grounded. Even if she was just sleeping, her presence was soothing. Still, her mother was elderly and lived on her own. This was the third bad turn she'd had this year, so I knew Claire had to go. She'd finished gathering her things, stopping at the door to kiss me goodbye before reaching for the handle. I instinctively closed my eyes as she opened the door. Although the scratching I'd heard earlier had stopped, I still in no way wanted to risk glimpsing that dog while Claire was around. She wished me goodbye, and I wished her luck, before she disappeared onto the other side of the door, closing it behind her, leaving me alone in the empty hallway again. The memories of the first time that she'd left filled my head. The scratching noise I'd heard against the door, and the fear that had come with it. I could feel it rearing its head again somewhere buried deep within. It began gnawing at me as I made my way back into the living room, not subsiding even as the rest of the day marched on. As I pottered around the house, feeling even more vulnerable now than before, I was aware of exactly how on edge I'd become. Even the most innocent of sounds, like the ticking of the clock or the rumbling of the boiler, seemed to cause me to startle. The oppressive weight of the tiredness that had hung above me for the past several days seemed to swell. Even the idea of moving seemed like a great effort to my overtaxed and exhausted body. My mind was muddied with the fog that seems to come through exhaustion, as though it was wading through a bog with each thought. I needed rest, and I needed sleep, as much as the prospect of listening to the dog's cries throughout the night terrified and enraged me. Dragging myself to my bedroom, I collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to close the curtains or even get changed out of my clothes. Their comfortable softness enveloped me as I slipped gently into a heavy sleep. I don't know how long I'd been out for, but when I next opened my eyes, the room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight leaking in through the uncovered window. It had seemed to spread throughout my quiet room, coating everything in an eerie white glow, transforming the once familiar surroundings into a new, alien landscape. Groggily, I sat up, wiping the sleep from my eyes, and clumsily began to make my way over to the closet to change out of my clothes and into some pajamas. That's when I heard it. From downstairs, that faint scratching that had tormented me for so many weeks started up again. Softly, something scratched at the door, each pawing sound echoing around in my head. I couldn't take it anymore. I just wanted to be left alone. I couldn't stand the constant scratching and howling that was following me around the house. I began shaking visibly, my hands trembling as they balled into tight fists. I just wanted to be left alone. Was that too much to ask? If these sounds were in my mind, then there had to be a way to get rid of them. Maybe I could force myself to get rid of them. After all, my brain would be the thing that was making them, wouldn't it? If I could just prove to myself once and for all that that dog wasn't real, then maybe my subconscious mind would realise it too. Maybe everything would go back to normal, and I could go back to my life. Everyone kept saying they couldn't hear or see anything whenever I talked about it. What reason would they have to lie? Spurred on by that thought, I found my eyes drawn to the bedroom window. For the first time in weeks, I looked at it with open eyes, seeing the glowing moonlight pouring through. The garden was illuminated in the same eerie twilight that had spread across the bedroom. Long shadows seemed to stretch from the small bushes and plants that Claire had painstakingly planted last year to freshen up the empty space. It felt odd, looking outside after all this time. A part of me was screaming at me that this was a bad idea, to just leave it and close my eyes. But the nagging fear in my mind had been suppressed by rage, and I needed to rid myself of this thing once and for all. As I slowly scanned the depths of the garden, taking in the new, strange twilight shapes of its landscape, my eyes were drawn to a pair of glinting objects from within the darkened patch of shadow next to my shed. Squinting, I tried to get a better look at whatever it was, comparing the now unknown space to the daytime image that I could clearly see in my head, in an attempt to place whatever it was. Then they moved. Slowly, they started making their way from behind the shed, out into the glowing moonlight. Unease stirred in me, screaming for me to close my eyes, as I knew what I was about to see. Stepping out into the moonlight, those glinting objects, their long edges reaching out like sinister fingers. They were looking up, fixed on me as the snout of the dog began to make its way out into the open space of my garden, followed by the rest of the creature that had been tormenting me for so long. My jaw dropped as I saw it now. It looked perfect. The fur, now glossy and smooth, as though it had recently been washed, in no way resembled the creature that I'd first encountered. Its muscles, clearly visible and defined, covered its now thick frame as its tail wagged happily behind it. Other than those eyes, there was no indication that this dog wasn't a different dog entirely. One that had jumped over the fence from a neighbour's house or something. Those eyes still maintained their dead, milky stare though. The one that made me feel as though it was looking into me from somewhere deeper within. The one that caused the eerie feeling to swim through me each time I looked at them. I shuddered, a feeling of sickness washing over me as I remembered my uncle's face. Those same milky dead eyes that had looked at me as he lay there on the marble floor of his manor. They were the same. The dog slowly slinked into the centre of the garden, moving with a sleek grace through the maze of shrubbery, before finally coming to a halt. All of the while, it didn't take its eyes off me. It turned again to face me, before sitting and watching me, still as the grave. As I stared back at it, I couldn't help the creeping chill that began crawling along my skin. There was something about that dog that seemed to resonate now with the primal part of my brain. The part that was telling me to run, to get as far away as I could. Something around its mouth glinted in the pale moonlight, drawing my eyes away from the milky orbs that hadn't moved from me since I noticed them. Squinting down again, I could just about make out the corner of something protruding from the left side of the dog's maw. It was white and pointed, like a folded piece of paper, or the corner of one at least. It had never held anything before, I thought to myself. So what was the significance of this? As if sensing my staring, the dog slowly lowered its head, its gaze unmoving. With an unnatural grace and care, it dropped the contents of its mouth onto the grass before it. Now I could see it clearly, illuminated in the moonlight. A pinwheel. It was a pinwheel. Why was it holding a pinwheel? My mind began racing, attempting to come up with any possible reason that dog, the creature that had haunted my dreams, was such an obscure, strange object in his mouth. Sifting through my cascading thoughts, something flashed to the forefront of my mind, only briefly. The hazy memory of a garden, lined with flowers. White pinwheels were lining the flower beds on either side. There were several of them, placed periodically along the flower beds like tiny windmills. The children enjoyed them. They liked watching them twirl in the wind. Then, that sick feeling began to climb in my throat as it fell into place. My neighbour's garden. It was a pinwheel from my neighbour's garden. A jolt of terror shot through me as I desperately tried to connect the dots. Was this another trick? Another test of my sanity? Was it trying to tell me who it would kill next? Was it even there? I felt sick just thinking about my neighbour and her daughter, sound asleep next door, unaware of the potential horror that could soon await them. The anger and confidence I'd garnered before began to ebb away slightly as my mind raced. If I hesitated any longer, it would leave me completely, and I'd never know for certain if this was all in my head. I needed to prove that the dog wasn't real. Racking my brain, I tried to think of the best possible test, a definitive way that I could prove to myself once and for all that this dog was nothing but a figment of my imagination. But in my exhausted, terrified state, that proved harder than expected. After a few seconds, I settled on the best plan I could think of. By no means was it the surest method to prove its existence, but it would definitely help, I hoped. I knew it was the middle of the night, and that she'd be annoyed that I'd woke her, especially when she was looking after a sick mother. But if I could just video call Claire, show her exactly what I was seeing out of the window, then maybe that would be enough. I know when my boss looked at the photo of the dog, he couldn't see anything. But then that wasn't a live feed. I'd only ever asked people about the dog after it had gone, not when I was looking directly at it. Maybe this would stop its disappearing act. Maybe if I just didn't take my eyes off it. Quickly, I turned away from the window and shot across the room. My phone was sitting on the bedside table, charging as usual. I snatched it up in my hand, quickly running back to the window, unlocking it as I got ready to call her, to end this nightmare once and for all. Frantically flicking my eyes across the scene, I stopped dead, an icy cold emanating through me. The garden was empty. The small bushes with their stretching shadows were the only things visible in that pale moon's glow. There was no sign that anything had been there at all. An odd feeling of calming despair began to set in as I came to the realization that I must have hallucinated the entire thing. The dog wasn't real. It mustn't have been. All the times I've seen it, I must have imagined it. No one else had ever been able to see it, because there was nothing there to see. The deaths that I'd seen were mere coincidences. Coincidences that I'd linked to this imaginary dog in my head as a way to deal with them. As I began to turn away from the window, a slight smile spread across my face with the knowledge that I was just crazy, that there wasn't really a monstrous entity stalking me in the form of a dog. Just as I began to turn away, a small breeze from outside caused a slight movement that caught my eye. I looked up again, scanning the garden's twilight for the source. What I saw sent my mind reeling again. I threw the curtains closed and ran to my bed, curling up and crying, crushed by the weight of the startling series of realizations that now bombarded me. The dog was real. I knew that now for sure. There was no way it couldn't be now. Every time I'd seen it had really been there, appearing to me before causing some horrific accident. That small feeling of vindication that had come with the previous realization was soon crushed by this new realization that I'd just looked at it again. I'd looked into its milky dead eyes through the window. Claire wasn't here, thank God. But there would be somebody somewhere close by who would now be suffering a horrific, untimely fate. All because of me. Because I'd decided to look. Tears flowed across my cheeks as I imagined my neighbour and her daughter next door. Both of them collapsed on the floor, cold and blue-faced, pain etched into their expressions. That image lingered there, floating just in front of my vision, no matter how much I tried to shake it off. I knew it would be them that was killed next. The dog had told me as much. The white pinwheel that had been slowly rocking back and forth on my lawn with the breeze. It had still been there when I looked out again, right where it had dropped it. That was all it needed to show me. I don't know what that dog is, or what it wants, but it's obvious that it's tethered to me somehow. I know for certain that it's never going to leave me alone now. Death seems to cling to it, and now it's following me. I have no idea what I'm going to do yet, but it's obvious that I can't just stay here. It's too dangerous. The chances of accidentally seeing it are too great. All it would take would be for me to drop my guard for a single moment. To look into a mirror that's angled outside, or some other reflection that I wasn't expecting, and then someone would die. Heck, the dog might even give up waiting and just come into the house, somehow force me to look at it. Claire's not back yet, thank God, but I can't put her in danger. She's the most important thing to me, and I'd never forgive myself if anything ever happened to her. Especially not if it was me that caused it. The only thing I can think to do is to leave. Go somewhere off the grid, somewhere isolated. I know it'll destroy Claire, but if there's no one around me, then maybe that dog won't be able to kill anyone else. Maybe I won't cause any more deaths. I can't think of another way to stop this. Thinking about how Claire will react when she gets back and finds the house empty, it's making me choke up in my throat just thinking about it. But hopefully, in time, she'll understand. I need to do this for her, to save her. Please, all of you. If you ever see anything out of the ordinary, just listen to your gut. It's feeling like that for a reason. Even if your brain thinks otherwise, don't trust it. Don't end up like me.